Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dr. Himanshu Mathur. On behalf of Jaipur Rehab, I welcome you all on this auspicious day of a sunny Saturday. Okay, I welcome you with a new topic, with the second topic of the module 3 of the online free biomechanics classes. So here we come, mechanics of the thoracic spine. Okay, so start with the things right here. Before I start, I must convey a huge gratitude to all of you people. Thank you so much, everybody, that you came across and you gave a test. मैंने देखा आप लोगों ने काफी सारे टेस्ट जो हम लोगों ने लास्ट में अपलोड किए हैं. You gave all those tests and so that was really good. आप लोगों ने अच्छे मार्क्स स्कोर किए हैं. You people are doing good in those tests and you people must be learning, I think. Okay, अगर आपको फिर भी if you're having any questions regarding the same topics, you can just contact to me on any sort of say social media. You can WhatsApp it to me, you can write it to me on email, you can write it to me on Telegram, you can write it to me on Facebook, you can write it to me on Instagram, anywhere you want. Available everywhere. I'll be available to answer you everywhere, to solve your queries every time. So here we go today with the biomechanics of the thoracic spine. Last week, we successfully completed the biomechanics of cervical spine. Although the biomechanics of the thoracic spine is not a very big topic, that is why I chose only one day, because I thought, the major crux of the biomechanics, including the kinetics and the muscles and everything else, is being covered while we are talking about the biomechanics of the cervical spine. And the rest will be covered while we are talking about the biomechanics of the lumbar spine, right? So it is somewhere between the biomechanics of both the cervical spine and lumbar spine, right? So let us try and see how we can talk about the biomechanics of the thoracic spine in today's talk. Okay. Just a second. I hope this one's quite visible to you people. All right. Okay. So again, I would convey very warm good afternoon to all of you. And here we shall start with the biomechanics of thoracic spine. I won't be going into too much of anatomy of it, but we'll try to see some biomechanical components and biomechanical characteristics of the segments that we're talking about. So thoracic spine is distal to that of the cervical spine and proximal to that of the lumbar spine. That was such a lame thing to be talked about, right? Okay, so we have 12 distinct vertebrae when we talk about the thoracic spine. And they are also known as dorsal vertebrae because they make a very visible posterior convex of or the posterior hump or the posterior kyphosis that we know that it is known as, right? They have very long, as you can see, such a beautiful component here. This is moving, rotating and showing it to you people, that how beautiful the architecture of this particular segment of the spine is, right? So without wasting any time, I must move a little more ahead. So we'll be talking about the thoracic spine. I gave you a little introduction about it. So the thoracic spine is majorly divided into upper thoracic spine, middle thoracic spine, and lower thoracic spine. First 2 to 3 vertebrae, including the T1, T2, T3, are considered into the upper thoracic spine. That from T4 to T8 are considered into middle thoracic spine. And from T9 to T12, again, it is considered into lower thoracic spine, right? So middle thoracic spine is considered to be typical thoracic spine vertebrae because they are distinctly having the features of the thoracic spine. The upper thoracic spine ones are resembling more of the characteristics of that of the lower cervical spine, and the lower thoracic spine resembles more characteristics of that of the upper lumbar spine, right? Because these are the evolving segments of the vertebrae, evolving segments of the thoracic spine, right? So evolution from the cervical spine to the thoracic spine continues till first 2-3 vertebrae of the thoracic spine, and evolution from thoracic spine to the larger, more weight-bearing lumbar spinal vertebrae starts from the lower thoracic spine, right? So the classical thoracic spinal vertebrae are seen in the middle portion of the thoracic spine, right? Now let us see what is actually this classical middle thoracic spine looks like. So it is somewhat looks like this. So always remember, although they are bigger in size as compared to that of the cervical spine, because in the cervical spine the weight bearing was relatively less as compared to that of the thoracic spine. We have larger weight to be carried because not only the head, we have to carry the upper thorax also, right? If we are talking about the middle thoracic spine, there is upper thorax or upper back structure whose weight we have to carry onto these vertebrae. This is the reason why we have a relatively larger vertebral body. Larger vertebral bodies will eventually help you to bear more weight or have more weight or transfer more weight which is coming from the upper side of the body, and it has to transmit it to the lower side of the body, right? This is the reason why we have a relatively stronger and a relatively larger vertebral body. We have larger this also spinous process also, but at the same time we have small excursions in all the planes that we talk about. Although thoracic spine also has movement in all the three planes, the degree of freedom is always 3 in this case also, but the excursion and the movement is relatively less as compared to the cervical spine. Although it is quite less in the lumbar spine also, but compared to the cervical spine, it is less in that of the thoracic spine, right? So it means that the major component that we talk about here is, it means that we have more stabilizing structures, we have more geometrical stability here. आर्टिकुलर ज्योमेट्री जो है, जो बनावट है इस जॉइंट की, आर्किटेक्चर कुछ ऐसा है यहाँ पे जिसकी वजह से यहाँ पे हमेशा स्टेबिलिटी ज्यादा रहती है, मोबिलिटी बहुत ज्यादा नहीं, ऑल्दो है, ऐसा नहीं कहेंगे मोबिलिटी है यहाँ पे, लेकिन स्टेबिलाइजिंग स्ट्रक्चर, स्टेबिलिटी ज्यादा है यहाँ पे, राइट? बिकॉज it is the key link between your upper body and the lower body, right? It is transmitting weight from your upper body to the lower body, right? Now let us see what how does the structure of the classical thoracic spinal vertebrae looks like. So the diameter of the vertebral body is slightly larger in the anterior posterior direction, right? So and lesser as compared to in the medial lateral direction. So always remember, if it is more in the anterior posterior direction, so there will be more range of the movement in the sagittal plane, lesser ranges of movement in the this also frontal plane also, and in the rotational plane also, right? Because it is not classically round or classically elliptical as we have seen in the previous slides also in the cervical spine also, right? Now the ratio between the anterior posterior and medial lateral diameters varies only slightly throughout the thoracic spine, although it varies slightly, but it is more in the anterior posterior direction, right? The bodies of the thoracic vertebrae are wedge-shaped, thicker posteriorly than anteriorly. Okay, they are more thicker posteriorly, lesser. Okay, now just see one small thing. If it is aligned like this in the whole kyphosis, right? Somewhere like this, and this. So it will always be there that anteriorly it will have a more compression force, right? Posteriorly it will be having a destructive force, more tensile force would be required in these structures posteriorly. More compression would be there anteriorly. Here also there will be more compression anteriorly. Here also there will be more compression anteriorly. This is the reason why anteriorly these vertebral bodies are more compressed as compared to posterior structure. This is the reason why the aperture is relatively smaller anteriorly as compared to the posterior aperture or posterior structure or posterior height of the vertebral body. Okay, so this was something about the vertebral body, dimensions of the vertebral body. Now one very important structure we have in the vertebral body. This is the half facet that we have on either side of the vertebral body. If you can see it here, this one. It is a half facet. Okay, it is known as hemifacet, or it is also known as a demifacet, right? Demifacet means it is a pseudo facet because it is not a complete facet, right? Two adjacent vertebrae has half facet on the upper one, half facet on the lower one, they combines with each other and makes a complete facet that eventually articulates with the head of the articulating rib. Okay, that articulates with the rib and makes the costovertebral joint, right? The rib which is coming from anteriorly, starting from the sternum, that ends into the half demifacet of the superior vertebra, half demifacet of the inferior vertebra, right? So in this case, it articulates with this and makes a costovertebral joint, right? Now let us learn something about it. So the bodies of the thoracic vertebrae contains facets for articulations with the head of the ribs. Now, with the exception of the first, 10th, 11th and 12th vertebral bodies. Why? Because the ribs do not attach here. The 10th, 11th, 12th are floating ones. That is why they do not have any articulation with the this vertebrae. That is why they don't make any costovertebral joint, right? These bodies, all the other bodies possess half or demi facets, right, at their posterolateral aspect or on both the superior and inferior borders, right? So we'll have it on the superior posterolateral border of the vertebral body also, and the inferior side also, right? The half facet on the superior aspect of one of the vertebral body pairs with the inferior half facet of the body above to form the socket for the head of the rib, so as to make the joint that is called costovertebral joint. Okay, costovertebral joint. Okay, so this is the joint which is being made here. All right, chaliye. Now let us see what other things we can see here. Now, when we talk about such a beautiful vertebra is rolling around here, this is the actual figure of the actual structure of the thoracic spinal vertebra that we see here, right? Now, the orientation of the articular process and the facets directly affect the spinal motion. As we all know, we have studied when we were studying about the cervical spine that the orientation of the facet is 45 degrees from the frontal plane. So in this case, it becomes more steeper. I told you because it is meant more for stability, and the geometrical excursion because of the movement is typically less in comparison to your cervical spine also, and in comparison to your lumbar spine also, right? So in this case, you have very less amount of, say, this excursion available here. So if you can make an angle with this, so where it is going like this, wait, it is going somewhere like this, right? So if you make an angle with the, no, not right, like this. So if you make an angle with this, this becomes almost 10 to 15 degrees, right? It is written 10 here, but usually in different books you'll find values varying between 10 to 15 degrees, right? I'll just have to pause it for a while because of some technical reasons coming here. Just wait for a while. Just wait for a while. Some technical issues are being okay, I'm sorry. So we have to resume it from the point we started. All right. So we were somewhere here. So the differentiation we were talking about here was almost 15 degrees. 10 to 15 degrees is something that we have to look upon, right? So 10 to 15 degrees of deviation from the normal alignment is what is seen here, right? So this is the superior facet. Wait, I have to make it. Wait, yeah. So this is the superior facet. Okay, we'll mark it along with this. Okay, this is the demi facet. Okay, it is available onto the posterolateral margin of the vertebra superiorly also, and that is available inferiorly also. This is vertebral body. Okay, these are the inferior facets, inferior articulating facets. This is your spinous process. Okay, now these are the articulating facets, on the transverse process. Okay, this is the transverse process. Now, articulating facet, we have it on the transverse process also, which eventually articulates with the tubercle. There is a tubercle onto the vertebral surface of the rib that articulates with the costal facet of the transverse process, and they makes a joint that is known as costo transverse joint. Okay, so just like costo-vertebral joint, there is a costo-transverse joint also available, right? So we have two articulations of the rib on the posterior side, one with the transverse process making the costo-transverse joint, one with the vertebral body making the costo-vertebral joint. So we have quite stable thorax or quite stable rib cage here, which is making anteriorly, it is making the joint with the sternum. Posteriorly, it is making a joint with the two surfaces on the vertebra, right? One is on the transverse process, the other one is on to the posterolateral aspect of the vertebral body superiorly also, that on the inferiorly also, right? So it is making a joint with the demi-facet, making the costo-vertebral joint, right? So here you can see, if you can see this structure moving, you can see that there is more anterior-posterior diameter rather than the superior-anterior or superior-inferior or the medial-lateral diameter, right? It is not quite evident here, which is seen here, but if you can see live pictures or if you can see cadaveric images of such things, you'll be easily able to mark it out that it is quite depressed or quite narrowed from the anterior aspect as compared to the posterior aspect, right? So you'll always find that this diameter is always less than this diameter. Okay, this is quite greater in comparison to this because of ever falling compressive loading anteriorly, right? We have also studied while studying posture that if you study the thoracic spine, we know that the line of gravity falls anteriorly. If the line of gravity is falling anteriorly, there'll always be more compressive loading anteriorly and less compressive loading and more tensile loading on the posterior structures of the thoracic spine. Okay, so in thorax, the articular processes are more vertically aligned than in the cervical region, right? In the cervical region, we had an angle of 45 degree. Here we have an angle of say 10 degrees, right? So different regions, this value might vary according to different what you can say topographical region, geographical areas, different races, male, female. Also, it can have a little more difference. Okay. Now, talking about the supporting structures are the ligaments. So the ligaments are no different as we had studied during the cervical spine. So we'll definitely try to brush it up because I've taken a picture in which this short forms are given. Okay, so be ready for questions. Also, I'll be asking you questions into it, right? So starting from the anterior most, we have ALL. ALL stands for anterior longitudinal ligament. Okay, anterior longitudinal ligament. As we all know that it is present onto the anterior aspect of the vertebral bodies, giving you anterior stability, right? It gets taught whenever you're going into say usually it is being said that whenever you go into extension, so it limits the extent of extension, right? So the first ligament that we talk about is ALL, which is a very, very, very strong ligament. If you can see it here, the cut section, the cross-sectional area is quite larger for this ligament, right? So we can say that it is a quite a strong ligament, right? Coming on to the posterior aspect of the vertebral body, the structure is PLL, that is the posterior longitudinal ligament, right? Posterior longitudinal ligament. Okay, Posterior longitudinal ligament, again, it provides you the posterior stability of the vertebral body. Okay, these two ligaments are specifically concentrated towards giving you stability on the anterior and posterior aspect of the vertebral body, right? It usually, not always, and it is not a primary restraint to the flexion movement, but it gets taught whenever you go into this posterior, inflections, right? Coming on to the other ligament, that is ISL. ISL stands for Interspinous Ligament. Okay, this is the Interspinous Ligament, right? So you have interspinous ligament that is available between the margins of the spinous process, the inferior margin of the above superior vertebra, and the superior margin of the inferior vertebra, right? So this ligament spans between this structure. Okay, these two structures, right? This is called interspinous. Now, this is one of the major ligament that gets taught whenever you go into flexion, and it is one of the restraints of the flexion movement, right? Similarly, we have another structure that is ITL, that is intertransverse ligament, right? It is located between the two transverse processes, and whenever you go into side bending and whenever you go into rotation onto the contralateral side, remember contralateral side, right? If I'm rotating on right or if I'm side bending onto the right side, it will always be the left-sided intertransverse ligament, which will be the limiting structure, which will be getting stretched. Okay, so this is the action of the intertransverse ligament. All right. We have another ligament coming here, which is a very superficially placed ligament, that is the supraspinous ligament. Supraspinous ligament is located onto the tips of the spinous process. The posterior, the most posterior margin of the spinous process here, it connects the most posterior margin of the spinous process beneath and the above one also, right? So it is also a continuing, long continuing ligament which connects the most posterior tips of the spinous processes, right? So this is called the supraspinous ligament. Supraspinous ligament is one of the primary restraint ligaments which gets taught whenever you go into flexion, right? It is one of the primary structures, mark my words, one of the primary structures that limits your movement, flexion movement, right? Now, another thing which is left is your facet joint capsule, right? Whenever you go into flexion and whenever the articulating surface, the inferior facet of the superior vertebra goes anterior and superior, this gets stretched, these fibers get stretched, and this stretch limits the flexion. It is again one of the primary structures that limits your flexion movement, right? Flexion movement. Now this one is left. This is written LF. Now I want you people to tell me what is LF. Write it in the comment box. Fatafat jaldi. All those people who are listening to me, write it in the comment box that what is this LF? What do you mean by this LF? I want you people to write what is LF. Okay, I can see it here. What do you mean by LF? Good, good, good. There have been few people who are writing. Very good, very good. Correct you are. Correct you are. Anybody else who want to write? You can write it. Very good. I'll give you last 10 seconds about it. 10, 9, 8, 6, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and that's it. All right, wonderful. So many of you people have wrote about it, and that is very correct. That is the ligamentum flavum. Okay, now ligamentum flavum is the structure that limits the posterior translation of the superior vertebra. Am I speaking true or false? Am I right or wrong? Ligamentum flavum is the structure that limits the forward translation of vertebra. Sorry, backward translation of vertebra. I'm sorry. Am I true or false? क्या मैं सही बोल रहा हूँ या गलत हूँ? It limits the posterior translation of vertebra. Is it true or false? Ligamentum flavum limits the posterior translation of the vertebra. Is it true or false? Come on, come on, come on. Fast, fast. I want your answers. You people can listen to it. Come on, come on, come on, come on. Tell me, is it true or false? Is it true or false? Is it true or false? Just one answer. What about the others? I want others also to please participate. Two answers I have it. Two answers I have it right now. Two answers I have it right now. Okay, three. Anybody else? Anybody else who want to write it? Anybody else who want to write it? Come on, come on, come on, come on, come on. 2 true and 3 false I have received till now. Ligamentum flavum limits posterior translation of the vertebra. Is it true or false? Is it true or false? Write it fast, write it fast, write it fast. Okay, now I've started getting answers and most of you are correct. So it is false. Ligamentum flavum limits the anterior translation of the vertebra. It does not limit the posterior translation. Okay, I told you that it starts its attachment, the proximal attachment of the ligamentum flavum starts from the inner surface of the posterior aspect of the spinal canal, and then it comes out and gets attachment onto the posterior aspect of the outer surface of the spinal canal, right? Somewhere near to the lamina, right? So it gets attached onto it. So whenever, so it gets attached like this. So whenever some structure moves anteriorly, it gets taut. Okay, it gets attached like this. So whenever some structure moves anteriorly, this gets taut. Okay, if it is getting taut, it pulls it back. The tensile strength, although the tensile strength of the ligamentum flavum is quite large, right? So the ligamentum flavum limits is again one of the primary restraint of the flexion movement, right? It is one of the major ligament that limits your flexion movement, right? So the last ligament for us today is ligamentum flavum. Always remember, it is a very, very, very important ligament, right? In cases where the people have reduced kyphosis, reduced lordosis, in such cases there is quite anterior translation of the vertebra, especially in case of hyperkyphosis also. I'm sorry. So in case of hyperkyphosis, there is increased shear forces between the vertebral bodies. So the anterior translation increases quite well, and this ligament overworks to limit this anterior translation, and eventually it gets hypertrophied. Now, we know that the proximal end of this ligament resides inside the spinal canal. So this hypertrophy occupies a significant space inside the spinal canal. This over-occupancy of space in the spinal canal limits the space of the spinal cord and the other neural structures, right? So it compresses those structures, right? So this condition is known as spinal canal stenosis, right? So this is the situation known as spinal canal stenosis. It is quite evident in cases of lumbar spine, but it could be there in the thoracic spine as well. Fine. It is quite rampant in case of cervical spine also. Right. Chalo. Let us move a little more ahead, and we have reached to the basic biomechanics, including the kinematics of the thoracic spine. So as I told you, we have 3 degrees of freedom here. So the movement occurs in all the planes. Okay, the movement occurs in all the planes. So we have flexion extension in the sagittal plane, frontal plane may we have side bending onto the right and left, axial rotation in the horizontal plane towards the right side and the left side, right? So as I told you, it has larger anteroposterior diameter. So always remember, it will always have more movement in case of sagittal plane, right? So there's almost 30 to 40 degrees of flexion available and 20 to 25 degrees of extension available, which eventually makes it of 50 to 70 degrees of total sagittal plane motion, right? 50 to 70 degrees of total sagittal plane motion is available here. Fine. Axial rotation is about 30 degrees and the lateral flexion is about 25 degrees available here, right? Coming on to the arthrokinematics. Let me write arthrokinematics here, okay? So that everybody who will be watching it afterwards also will be remembering it. Okay, so first of all, we will be talking about the sagittal plane arthrokinematics. Okay, this is the sagittal plane arthrokinematics. So it is quite same. It follows the same pattern as we have followed in the case of lower cervical spine. So whenever I'm going into flexion, the inferior facet of the superior vertebra, I mean this will slide superior and anterior. Okay, it will slide superior and anterior. All right. Now the primary restraining structures will be, it will be the capsule of this particular joint. Okay, the posterior capsule of the zygapophyseal joint, interspinous ligament will be there, supraspinous ligament will be there, and one more ligament will be there. What is its name? We just had a word in the last slide. Tell me the name of one more structure which will be limiting flexion. One more structure which will be limiting flexion will be, come on, write it in the comment box fast. One more structure that would be limiting this flexion would be, one would be capsule, one would be interspinous, one would be supraspinous, one more. Yes, LF. This is ligamentum flavum. This will be ligamentum flavum. One last structure that would be limiting structure would be ligamentum flavum. Okay, so always remember the inferior facet of the superior vertebra will be moving superiorly and anteriorly. Okay, limiting structures would be posterior capsule of the zygapophyseal joint, ligamentum flavum, interspinous ligament, and supraspinous ligament. All right. Although there could be some limitations with the posterior longitudinal ligament also, but these are the primary restraining structures. Okay, now coming back from flexion would be the extension of it, because we cannot straighten the thoracic spine and reduce the kyphosis of it. So coming back from flexion would be considered to be extension. Okay, now this would include the migration of the inferior facet of the superior vertebra in the direction of inferior and posterior. Okay, the superior vertebra, the inferior facet of the superior vertebra will be moving inferior and posterior. Okay, now you know one of the primary restraining structure here is, it is not anterior longitudinal ligament, it is eventually the articular geometry of this. See, अब देखो यहाँ तक था वो छोटे छोटे थे, क्योंकि हमने पहली बात कही थी it is more vertically aligned. वो पिछली बार की तरह ऐसे नहीं है, it is more vertically aligned this time. वो already ऐसे ही पड़ा है, जब पहले ऐसे गया था तो flexion में इतना गया, अब extension में आ गया तो इतना ही आ पाएगा. It does not have too much space here, right? So if it does not have too much space here, so ideally it is the articular geometry of the zygapophyseal joint and the over occupying space by the spinous process of this particular vertebra. They could be the major reasons behind a reduced excursion of the extension movement, right? Rather than the other soft tissue structures. Although there are soft tissue structures, including the anterior longitudinal ligament, it could be one of these structures that could limit the extension movement. But moreover, it is the articular geometry which is limiting this particular movement, right? So always remember this. Coming on to the other aspect, now coming on to the rotational, that is the horizontal plane movement. Okay, this is into the horizontal plane. Fine. Horizontal plane, it is the side to side movement. So if I am rotating towards the right side, there will be more distraction onto the contralateral side and more approximation onto the this side, ipsilateral side, right? So there will ideally be a little sliding of the vertebra opposite to the side of rotation, right? If I am rotating right side, the sliding will be more on the left side, more distraction, more what you can say, this distraction onto the contralateral side and more approximation on the ipsilateral side. Intertransverse ligament and supraspinous ligament could be the structures that could limit this particular motion, right? Coming on to the lateral flexion occurs in the frontal plane. All right. So frontal plane motion, we have lateral flexion. In the lateral flexion, again, you can see that very easily that the inferior facet of the superior vertebra will be coming posterior and inferior on the ipsilateral side and will be going superior and anterior on the contralateral side, right? So inferior plus posterior on the ipsilateral side and superior and anterior on the contralateral side, right? So the intertransverse ligament of the contralateral side would be the limiting structure. It could be the posterior capsule of the zygapophyseal joint of the contralateral side. That could also limit this particular motion, right? There are no other structures that could play a very important role in limitations of such movements. Okay, so this is something about the arthrokinematics in all the other joints. Now coming on to the accessory joints that the rib makes with the thoracic spine. So we have two of such joints, additional joints, which are available in the thoracic spine. One is the costovertebral joint, the other one is the costotransverse joint. As we have already talked about this particular thing, that the head of the rib articulates with the facet made by the conjugation of two vertebrae. Two vertebrae, hemifacet or the demifacet on the superior vertebra and demifacet on the inferior vertebra. These two vertebrae come close to each other. These two facets come close to each other and makes a complete whole facet, which eventually helps for the articulation of the head of the rib. All right, so this makes the costovertebral joint. Although there are a few joints, soft tissue structure which helps to stabilize this, which includes your articular capsule, which includes intra-articular ligament, which includes the radiate ligament, right? So intra-articular ligament is a very thin ligament which continues onto the superior surface of the both articular surfaces, right? Capsule is all we know that, and it blends with the another ligament, which is a very quite spreaded ligament. It is called the radiate ligament. It has been given the name because of its structure, which is quite available and visible to you people, that it spans from all the circumference of the whole head of the rib, and it starts from the superior surface of the demifacet of the superior vertebra, and it covers the whole demifacet. Then it covers the whole adjacent intervertebral disc, and it again covers the inferior demifacet also on the inferior aspect of the vertebra, right? So it gives you very good amount of stability in this context onto the costovertebral joint, right? Let us see what these people has to say. Now, most costovertebral joints connect the head of the rib with a pair of costal facets and the adjacent margin on an intervening intervertebral disc. Okay, this is the portion of the intervertebral disc. Okay, the articular surface of the costovertebral joint are slightly ovoid, held together by a capsular and a radiate ligament. Okay, radiate means it is making a star divergent. Okay, it is making such structure. Okay, this is the radiate structure. All right, so this radiate structure is made by this particular ligament known as the radiate ligament. All right, now the next joint it makes in this particular region is the costotransverse joint. Here, costotransverse joint. Now this is the joint made by the neck and the other parts of the body of the rib to the costal surface of the transverse process, right? This surface of the transverse process makes joint with this surface of the rib. Okay, now what does this has to say about this particular joint? The costotransverse joint connects the articular tubercle of a typical rib to the costal surface onto the transverse process. I'll take you to a few slides before where we have talked about the structure. This structure, if you can remember this structure here, right? In this structure we have somewhere here, this is the costal facet onto the transverse process, or the articulating facet on the transverse process for the rib. So the anterior tubercle of the rib articulates with this particular facet onto the transverse process, right? Always remember this. Coming on to our own topic. The extensive costotransverse ligament, this one is the costotransverse ligament, firmly anchors the neck of the rib to the entire length of the corresponding transverse vertebra. Make sure that the ligament covers the whole length of the transverse vertebra. Although this surface of the transverse process does not have articulation with the neck of the rib, but this ligament spans over the whole length of the transverse process, so as to give more stability to the costotransverse joint and the rib on the posterior margin of it, right? Because thoracic spine is a relatively moving structure, but we have to give immense amount of stability to the rib so as to make our thoracic cage stable, right? This is why we need extensive amount of stability here. Okay, now each costotransverse joint is stabilized by a superior costotransverse ligament The strong ligament attaches between the superior margin of the neck of one rib and the inferior margin of the transverse process of the vertebra located above. Okay, so this the superiorly lying structure, that if you people can visualize it here, so this is the superior costo transverse ligament that plays a very important role here. Now coming on to the muscle interaction things, coming on to the kinetic portion of this. So usually the muscles here are divided. See, you do not have a specific group of muscle for these thoracic spine. Most of the muscles that work on the cervical region are included into the thoracic region. The other muscles that are majorly working onto the lumbar region, they also have their actions onto the this thoracic spine, right? So we usually divide the muscles here into superficial group and a deep group. So as we have already talked about such a classification, the superficial groups are located superficially. It means they have a larger momentum. Okay, if they have a larger momentum, the torque generated by these muscles will always be larger. Okay, we eventually do not require any isolated flexors for thoracic spine, because we always have a convexity, posterior convexity, and a kyphosis at the thoracic spine, which eventually lays our line of gravity quite interior to that of the basic mechanical line of the thoracic spine, which aids physiological flexion, right? So we do not require any such flexors for this particular area. So we require stabilizing extensors. And because we are having this structure, kyphotic structure of the spine, and there is a physiological flexion available here, so we would require the muscles that could work all the time, right? So we would require major postural muscles that could work all the time to cause extension, right? So these muscles would cause extension at all the time. Eventually, they would be we would be requiring muscles that are endurance-based muscle. Okay, we would be requiring the muscles which are endurance-based muscle, not the strength-based muscles. Okay, so we all know that the muscles that have greater amount of type 1 fibers are the endurance-based muscles, and the muscles which have a greater amount of type 2B fibers are the major strength-based muscles, right? So the muscles that covers the whole extensor compartment of the thoracic spine includes more amount of type 1 fibers, right? This is why we call the erector spinae and the other extensor muscles of the this spine as the postural muscles, right? So here is the action of such muscles comes into action, right? Now let us see which are the superficial group of muscles coming here is. One is the latissimus dorsi, the other one is rhomboids, and the trapezius muscle. Trapezius one includes your middle trapezius also, and the lower trapezius muscles also, right? So these muscles are usually being included here, although the upper trapezius muscle also takes some attachment onto the upper thoracic spine, but we majorly talk about the middle trapezius and the lower trapezius muscles over here. Okay, now although there is no specific action stated of the latissimus dorsi. Okay, now if you can see the latissimus dorsi has its attachment from the ilium, it has attachments from the lumbar spine, it has attachments from the sacrum everywhere through the fascia overlying here, and it eventually takes one of its attachment onto the inferior pole of the scapula also. And then it starts from the middle thoracic spine towards the lower thoracic spine. So it has its action onto the lumbar spine also, sacrum also, ilium also. It has its action onto the scapula also, and eventually it gets its insertion onto the this humerus. Okay, so it has multiple attachments, so it has multiple actions also. So we cannot say that it must be having some significant action onto the thoracic spine also, right? So it does not play for any significant action for any this thoracic spine. But the measurements of flexion and extension momentums using magnetic resonance imaging suggest that it continues to have an extension momentum to at least the 5th thoracic vertebra. Although we don't know too much about the lower thoracic vertebra, but till the 5th thoracic vertebra, it plays a decent role in providing extension when working bilaterally. Okay, if it is working unilaterally, it can help to for a person to go into side flexion onto the ipsilateral side, right? If working bilaterally, it has some of the good momentums generated for the extension whenever it is crossing this particular area and it is going anteriorly from posteriorly. If you can see here, it is going anteriorly from posteriorly, okay, because it is starting from the back and then eventually it is coming onto the humerus, right? So from posterior it is traveling to anterior. So the distal most attachment of this particular muscle, or the what you can say insertion. So the muscle which lies onto its insertion portion, that acts onto the anterior portion of the thoracic spine, including with increasing your flexion moment, right? So you can say that it could be a poor extensor from its posterior compartment. It is a poor flexor from its anterior compartment, right? So it is such an amazing muscle which is traveling from posterior to anterior and giving both flexion and extension movements for particularly thoracic spine. So it is such a wonderful clinical insight for you people, right? Now, tightness in the latissimus dorsi is usually reported, and eventually it is there that increases the thoracic kyphosis. Okay, always remember the tightness of the latissimus dorsi increases the thoracic kyphosis. Now, coming on to the other two muscles, I've already told you that unilateral contraction of the trapezius, rhomboids, and the latissimus dorsi reportedly produces side bending and the rotation of the thoracic spine, right? So these muscles can also cause side bending and rotation of the thoracic spine. In individual with idiopathic scoliosis, the trapezius on the convex side exhibits relative increase in type 1 muscle fibers with slight atrophy of the type 2 fibers, and the trapezius and the rhomboids on muscles may contribute to the spine deformity. Now what happens is, if somebody is having this spinal scoliosis, thoracic scoliosis, the muscles on this convex side would be a little more stretched muscles, okay? They'll be stretched muscles. So the responsibility of these muscles eventually increases to keep this particular area in shape. Now, so as to keep this particular muscles, this area in shape, these muscles would have to fire continuously. Okay, these muscles will be firing continuously, so they'll be requiring more type 1 fibers rather than type 2 fibers, right? This again becomes an insight for the postural fibers, more postural fibers in the muscles lying in the thoracic region. Now, with their distal attachment fixed, the contraction of the trapezius and rhomboids, major and minor, could potentially produce contralateral rotation by pulling the spinous process towards its distal attachment, right? So they can cause the rotation by firing in this particular pattern, right? So you can do it by this thing. Now, this is the deep group. Before going to deep group, we have a few muscles in the deep group that includes your Erector Spinae and the Transverso Spinalis group. Transverso Spinalis group contains your multifidus, it contains your semispinalis group, it contains your rotator group. But the major muscle that forms the deep group is your Erector Spinae. Now, Erector Spinae has 3 muscles, which eventually has 3 parts. So we have a total of 9 muscles that comes in the Erector Spinae group, right? So we have spinalis group, we have longissimus group, we have iliocostalis group. Now, I will give you a very important insight that how to remember these muscles, okay? For this, I would be requiring a white screen. Okay. Now, always remember that these muscles, Erector Spinae muscle, starts from the head, the capital region, and it continues till that of the lumbar region, right? So let me divide the spine into the head region, the cervical region, the thoracic region, and the lumbar region, right? So we have 3 muscles, right? The one is spinalis muscle. The one is, second is longissimus muscle. The third one is iliocostalis. Okay, I'm giving you a very easier way to remember this. So this is the head region. So all the muscles that will be covering or crossing this region will have a suffix of capitis. All the muscles that will be crossing the head region will be termed as capitis muscles. The muscles that will be crossing the neck region will be termed as cervicis muscles. The muscles that crosses the thorax region, they'll be called as thoracis muscles. The muscles that will be crossing the lumbar region will be known as the lumborum muscles, right? Now we only another important, these are three muscles and each muscle only cover only three segments. Although we have four segments, but each muscle covers only three segments. Okay, so if this is segment 1, this is segment 2, this is segment 3, and this is segment 4, right? Now spinalis is the muscle that covers segment 1, 2, 3. Longissimus muscle covers segment 1, 2, 3. Iliocostalis is the muscle that covers segment 2, 3, and 4. Right? So if I talk about spinalis, the first segment is capitis. So it becomes spinalis capitis. Okay? The name is written everywhere onto the board, right? Spinalis capitis. The second one is number 2. Number 2 is your cervicis. So it becomes spinalis cervicis. Number three is the thoracic region or the thoracic muscle. So it will be called spinalis thoracis. Okay. So these are the three muscles of the spinalis. These are the three fibers of the spinalis muscle. Coming on to the longissimus muscle, again 1, 2, and 3. So okay, I think I'm visible to everybody now. I think yes. Let me share the screen once again. This was here, right? So I was telling you about the muscles, right? Okay, so the last group of muscle was iliocostalis muscle, right? The iliocostalis muscle, again has three fibers, that is 2, 3, and 4. Okay, that becomes your iliocostalis thoracis, iliocostalis cervicis, iliocostalis thoracis, and iliocostalis lumborum, right? Okay, now let us see what they have to see. They have to talk here. So the EMG data verify the role of erector spinae as the whole in extension of the trunk. And remember, everybody, this is the major muscle for the extension of the whole spine, including your cervical spine, including your capital spine, including your thoracic spine, and including your lumbar spine as well. Okay, this is one of the major postural muscles that is available here. The muscle contract eccentrically during the forward bending from standing position and concentrically as the spine returns to its erect position, right? The lateral contraction of the iliocostalis and longissimus muscle is associated with side bending also, and with the ipsilateral rotation of the spine. Okay. The longissimus muscle is a muscle that is a little more away from the spine. Okay, so it has some of the momentum in the frontal plane also, so contraction of this can cause a lateral flexion also. Spinalis is the muscle which is in close conjugation with the spinous processes. Okay, and iliocostalis has relatively more greater momentum in the frontal plane also, and in the cases of your sagittal plane also, right? So the erector spinae as a whole exhibits as a side bending momentum of 25 to 35 millimeter in the thoracic region, compared with the momentum in the that of approximately 50 millimeter in the extension also. So it has ample of momentum in the side bending also, ample of momentum in the sagittal plane for extension also, right? So always remember this. So the erector spinae in the thoracic region are composed primarily of type 1 fibers. As I told you earlier also, that these muscles are the postural muscles. That is the reason why they require more of the type 1 fibers here, okay, or slow twitch fibers, approximately 75% of it. But the erector spinae in the lumbar region exhibit a more even distribution of type 1 and type 2 fibers, because it is one region that is also responsible for load bearing and load dissipating, right? So it is 57% of type 1 fibers in the lumbar region and 53% of the type 2 fibers also, right? So always remember this particular thing. The preponderance of fatigue resistance muscle fibers in the thoracic spine suggests that erector spine in the thoracic region plays primarily role in the postural support and in stabilizing the costovertebral joint. This is the reason why I told you that this particular segment is majorly meant for stabilization. Okay, and the same muscle that in the lumbar region is giving you mobility, but here it is giving you more of the stability. All right. Coming on to the last section of our today's talk here, that includes the transverso spinalis group. Now, the transverso spinalis group has been named because these are the muscles that takes its one attachment onto the transverse process. They travels obliquely and take their distal attachment onto the, or they take their insertional attachment onto the spinous process. That is why it is known as transverso spinalis group of muscles. These muscles majorly consist of semi-spinalis muscles, multifidus muscles, and the rotator longus and brevis muscles. Okay, now these muscles contract eccentrically, although these are the deepest of all muscles. Okay, these are the deepest of all, so always have low momentum. And we all know till now the muscles that have low momentum will always generate low torque and will be good stabilizers. Okay, so again these muscles are good segmental stabilizers because these are running between single segments, okay, single or double segments, right? Although they can be biarticular muscles, but these are not like erector spinae that are covering 3, 4, 5, 6 segments or multi-articular segments. They'll travel small segments, right? And they are deepest of all muscles. Okay, they produce contralateral rotation by pulling the spinous process of the superior vertebrae towards the transverse process of the inferior vertebrae, right? They can also aid to that, but it is not a primary rotating muscle, okay, because it has low momentum and eventually lesser torque. The thoracic multifidus are longer and thinner, with the longer and more obliquely aligned tendons than in those in the lumbar region, okay, because it is a longer segment, it is a larger segment. The muscles, the multifidus muscle of this particular region are also longer, okay. The multifidus in the thoracic region are composed mostly of type 1 fibers, that is approximately 75. It is almost like the other extensor muscles also, that is the erector spinae muscles also. The reason is that this region is majorly meant for the stability, and this is the reason why we have more of type 1 fibers compared to type 2 fibers, right? So by this, probably we come to an end to our discussion of the day regarding the biomechanics of the thoracic spine. Now, if in case you have any queries related to it, you can definitely write it. Okay, there is a question. So somebody's asking. I remember the moment when you taught us the same formula in the workshop held in our university. And honestly, this helped me a lot. Thank you so much. Okay, thank you so much for this such a modest and kind review. Thank you so much. If you people have any questions, you can definitely write it in the comment box. Let me check if we have any more particular questions coming up here. Okay, we don't have questions till now. If you have any more questions, you can directly write it us onto the comment box. I'll be always there to answer it. If you do not have any more questions, if you generate the questions later on, you can send me the questions on any social media available. You can send it to me on WhatsApp. You can send it to me on Instagram, Facebook, Telegram, email, anywhere you want. You can send it to me, right? You can also write it in the comments of the YouTube video. This YouTube video also you can write it there. I'll be coming there and I'll be answering it to you people, right? So thank you so much for now. If you don't have any more questions, I'll be taking your leave. We are anyways done with the talk of the day. All right. Thank you so much for being with me today also. We do not have any session tomorrow. Let me make it out to everybody. We don't have any session tomorrow because it was a small topic. That is why I decided to take it only on this Saturday, right? So we don't have any biomechanics class tomorrow at 12. So it gives you an opportunity to go and see this whole class once again and try to have a better insight of this, because there will be a test coming for you people probably tomorrow or day after tomorrow. Okay, I can give you a rest of tomorrow, and there will be a test coming on to the same thing on Monday, right? So stay tuned, everybody, for the test. I request everybody to take active participation in the test so that you'll be able to evaluate it on yourself, right? So always remember that. Thank you so much for now. I'm Dr. Himanshu Mathur signing off from here. Thanks a lot. Stay home, stay safe, take care.